Perfect. Hello again, everyone. I will begin today's webinar. And again, questions, comments, concerns, leave them in the chat. I will do my best to answer them. If I don't have the answer, I will absolutely follow up with you with the answer. And if you guys want to also bounce off one another and talk as we go, feel free to do that. But in today's webinar, about how domestic violence and homelessness impact survivors' mental health wellness. It will be about 90 minutes long with 3 different parts. Part 1 is all about how domestic violence is rarely a singular issue. Part 2 is looking at the impacts of traumatic experiences on mental health wellness, and then ending it off with part 3, so how to build your toolbox to walk with survivors on their healing journey. PowerPoint slides and everything will be available at the end, so feel free to stick around till then. Certificate of attendance will be given at the end. We will also send out follow-up emails afterwards tomorrow to everybody who joined with all the information in there as well. So feel free to look out for that. But yeah. Before we do begin with part 1, though, I do want to read our full land acknowledgement. I am going to copy and paste the link to our full land acknowledgement in the chat in case anybody wants to go take a look at it on our website. But for the webinar, it says Women's Advocates. Work takes place on Dakota land. The area that is now St. Paul was stolen from the Dakota people by the American government through centuries of wars, broken treaties, and acts of cultural genocide. Through incredible perseverance and resistance, the Dakota are still here and strong. Native women and girls face the highest risk of domestic violence, sexual assault, and intimate partner homicide. We express our gratitude for the Indigenous-led organizations who are working each day towards a world without domestic and sexual violence. And as an organization, we commit ourselves to supporting tribal sovereignty with the same fervor that we support the self-sovereignty of victim survivors. Okay. Again, the link to the full land acknowledgement is in the chat. If you want to kind of browse around in our website as well, feel free to do that. But I will begin with part 1, domestic violence and how it's rarely a singular issue. I do have polls throughout this webinar. I'm going to launch the first one now. So if you can, please take this poll for me. If you scroll down, there will be 3 questions in total. Feel free to answer all 3. I'll give us time to answer this and really go through it. So if you can answer them, that would be highly appreciated. The first question asks, what do you think are survivors' top 2 primary needs? This first question is a multiple choice, so feel free to pick the top 2. The second question is a singular choice, and what % of homeless women with children have experienced domestic violence? And the third question is what % of all homeless women report domestic violence as an immediate cause of their homelessness? So again, feel free to take that poll. I'll give us some time to do that. And as we're all doing that, once all answers are submitted, I will go ahead and share the results with everybody. Do your best to answer. And please note that the correct answers to all these 3 questions will be answered in a few slides when we watch a short video. We're going to talk a little bit more about the organization, and then we'll dive into the topic. You will all get to watch a video. So watch out for the answers for all of these. A couple more seconds, and then I will end the poll. Okay, perfect. Thank you everyone for taking the poll. I will share the results. So this is what a lot of you said. So the first question, what do you think are survivors' top 2 primary needs? The number 1 answer, the one that got the most answer, is housing resources, though we do have answers all across the board. For the second question, What percent of homeless women with children have experienced domestic violence? The number one answer is 80%. Second most answered one is 64%, and 47% coming in third. Nobody chose 25%. What percent of homeless women report domestic violence as an immediate cause of their homelessness? The top two answers are 57% and 38%. Thank you all for taking the poll. Again, we're going to watch a short video in a couple minutes here, and all the answers will be in that video. But talking a little bit more about women's advocates and what we do. Women's advocates, we are a domestic violence shelter located in St. Paul, Minnesota. And we offer all sorts of resources from our 24/7 crisis line, education and outreach. So a lot of webinars, presentations, exactly what we're doing right now. All of you coming to watch and be a part of this webinar, you also know the issue with domestic violence, abuse, everything of the sort, and wanting to do your part, excuse me, in perhaps trying to stop abuse and domestic violence. A lot of you who have introduced yourself in the chat also work in some form of violence with victim survivors, whether that's youths or adults. So yeah, I'm guessing a lot of us are familiar with abuse and domestic violence. Again, we are a shelter located in St. Paul, Minnesota. We try to offer housing stability for all the folks that come and stay in our shelter. We have a child and family support programs. We also now have pet foster programs in our org. So if anybody is running away from an abusive situation or relationship and they have pets with them, and they can't bring these pets into shelters, we do offer a pet foster program where their pet will be in a safe foster home as they are trying to find employment and a stable, safe housing. But we started in the early 1970s as a legal advice helpline. And we were trying to help a lot of women who were seeking divorce when no-fault divorce was not a thing yet. So you couldn't divorce your spouses if they were being abusive. So a lot of women and children were calling this legal helpline looking for help get away from their abusive spouses. And a lot of the women who were working this legal helpline very quickly realized that a lot of these women who were calling were trying to escape abuse. And so they opened up their homes, trying to house a lot of these women and children. And of course, not a sustainable plan, but that was what was done to try and offer a lot of these women and their children safe housing. And then the first shelter in the nation was born because a lot of these women who are working the legal helpline figured something had to be done in order to provide proper, safe housing for a lot of these women and children who were trying to get away from their abusive spouses. And it's been over 50 years since. And now we have 3 different shelters connected in the St. Paul area, still doing our part in trying to end domestic violence and abuse. So that is our story. This is what we offer. Yeah, and this slide is again going into being housed, being unsafe. Homelessness is often, of course, unsafe. A lot of these women who were seeking divorce from their abusive spouses were faced with the decision to either stay in the abusive household and be housed, have a home, but go through abuse, or try and escape the abusive relationships, but then facing, of course, the dilemma of being homeless, especially if they have children, makes it very, very hard. And so again, the first shelter in the nation was born, called Women's Advocates, still here, still strong, doing our thing. Now, this is the video, the intersection of homelessness and domestic violence. I'm going to play it for us. Please watch it. Feel free to pay attention and see if you can catch any of the answers that were in the poll that we just took. Hopefully it'll work with me. You never know with technology.
Nobody should have to choose between staying in an unsafe
Do we hear it? Can somebody let me know in the chat if you can hear the audio?
home or having no home at all. But too often, that's the choice survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault have to make. Studies show that access to safe, affordable housing is one of survivors' biggest, most urgent concerns. This is why we can't end homelessness without addressing domestic and sexual violence. More than 80% of women with children who are experiencing homelessness have experienced domestic violence. And women are at a heightened risk of sexual assault before, during, and after periods of homelessness. Survivors of violence face real barriers when trying to access housing. Barriers caused by the power and control dynamics of abuse, a need for safety and confidentiality, economic instability, and the effects of trauma. And these barriers are often greater for those who are most marginalized in our society, including families of color, Native Americans, immigrants, LGBTQ people, people with disabilities, and individuals and families living in poverty or who are geographically isolated. So if we are going to end homelessness, we have to understand the connections between domestic violence, sexual violence, and housing instability, and create a framework that responds to the unique challenges and opportunities this intersection creates. In order to meet the needs of survivors and their families, we also need a greater range of housing options, from emergency shelters to transitional housing, to rapid rehousing, to permanent supportive housing. We need to continue to build the capacity of housing and homelessness programs to support survivors' safety, autonomy, and self-determination. And we need to build and strengthen partnerships between domestic and sexual violence organizations and housing and homelessness programs at the local, state, and national levels. These partnerships will give us the resources, strategies, and support we need as advocates, and the programs and policies that will support survivors' safety and stability. Together, through partnerships like these and survivor-centered policies and practices, we can end homelessness and improve families' lives. Learn more about survivor-centered housing at safehousingpartnerships.org.
Okay. So going deeper into the answers to the poll earlier, survivors' primary needs are housing and economic resources. 80% of homeless women with children have experienced domestic violence, and 57% of all homeless women report domestic violence as an immediate cause of their homelessness. If you do feel comfortable, leave in the chat if you picked any of these percentage, the answers, if you got them all correct. Did you know this beforehand? Did any of it surprise you? You know, do you hear this and your reaction is kind of like, well, that's expected, you know? Again, feel free to share your thoughts in the chat if you feel comfortable. But continuing to kind of underscore the connection between domestic violence and homelessness, is this HUD homelessness definition and the fact that domestic violence has its own definition that kind of speaks to the commonality of facing homelessness when experiencing domestic violence, whether that's because the family is running in fear of their lives, were evicted due to the actions of an abusive person, like destruction of property, inability to pay rent due to an abusive person denying the survivor's ability to work, or were otherwise displaced from their homes for reasons related to domestic violence. And the amount of available shelter beds, which is estimated to be around 417 in the Twin Cities, does not begin to meet the immediate housing needs of survivors. If you work in a shelter, if you work with victim survivors of domestic violence, I'm sure you know, shelters are always full. It's hard to find empty space to house a lot of victim survivors. And many people think that emergency shelters are sustainable solutions for survivors, but it is a short solution from facing the housing shortage and crisis, really, um, for more long-term units and spaces, um, which is why a lot of times we try to do our part in trying to provide and find safe, affordable housing for victim survivors. So, what do you think are some additional barriers that survivors face to accessing safe, affordable, sustainable housing? The video talked a lot about these barriers and what they are, but if you can think of any more, feel free to leave it in the chat. What are some barriers to trying to find safe, affordable housing? What barriers do you see? What barriers do you go through personally? What barriers do you see when you are working with victim survivors? Feel free to leave them in the chat. And as you are typing in the chat, if you do want to share your thoughts, even if I move on to the next slide, please continue to type and leave your thoughts in the chat. I would love to read them and see what you all have to say. But these are just some barriers to safe housing for survivors. Many of the barriers you all mentioned, well, many of the barriers that were mentioned in the video are listed on the screen as well. So again, if you can think of any other barriers, feel free to leave them in the chat. But in addition to these unique barriers, survivors are affected by the same economic barriers that challenges so many individuals. So things like, unemployment, the lack of affordable housing. Sometimes they just cannot afford affordable housing, and not just affordable housing, but safe housing as well. Rent is rising all the time, regardless of people's ability to pay it. Lack of living wages, ineffective or absent social safety nets, all compound the stress that many survivors have to face. And at places like WA, we have housing stability advocates, but not all survivors have that kind of continued support as they try to navigate housing and other systems. Especially if you can't find safe shelter space to kind of stay in, there's no advocates to help you. It's hard to navigate that on your own. Another aspect to kind of consider is that survivors learn through this grueling, intense, maze-like process of accessing support. So, again, if you would like to leave in the chats, I would like to invite you to think about being told things like, simply just leave this abusive relationship. As someone who has probably experienced a pattern and dynamic of abuse and then facing all these barriers to safe housing, kind of putting yourself in the shoes of victim survivors, or if you have gone through abuse yourself in the past, you probably know what this feels like when there are just so many barriers to leaving an abusive relationship, and people's response to you is really just, get up and leave the relationship. If you don't want to stay in this relationship, simply just go, pack your things, get your kids. But we all know that it's not that simple. So as we think about this and constantly having victim survivors hear this, what stories do they start to create about themselves and about their lives? Do they feel good about themselves? Do they feel hopeless, sad? So many survivors through this process begin to think and internalize thoughts like nothing will ever work out for me. Maybe my abuser was right. Maybe, I'm better off staying in this relationship. Um, and of course, they start to tell themselves these things when things start to seem really, really hopeless. And there's just no way for them to get over these barriers, find safe, affordable housing, finding a livable job with a livable wage. And so they start to tell themselves, like maybe they're better off in the abusive relationship. And a lot of times this causes the victim survivor to feel stuck. And so they end up staying in these abusive relationships. And as that happens, I'm sure, again, as we know, it can lead to a lot of victim blaming where you are choosing to stay in this relationship. You are not making the effort to leave. And that then again creates a lot more stress for the victim survivor to really try and get over all these hurdles, when the support system, the friends and family around them are not supporting them, instead blaming them for not being able to get past a lot of these very, very real hard hurdles in order to leave an abusive relationship. Okay. So these quotes on the screen contextualize everything we know about domestic violence with the experiences of homelessness. So paying attention to this context, kind of illuminates for us how many survivors end up feeling really depleted and deteriorated. And survivors who have experienced homelessness have been some of the most resilient, compassionate, and grateful-filled individuals we have ever had the pleasure of meeting and working with. Trust, working in a shelter. We see this all the time, very much. And a lot of victim survivors who get to stay with us were able to find safe housing. And they have scars, both visible and invisible, mental, emotional, physical scars that are a result of living in survival mode for so long, and often with no sense of security. So just kind of wanting to read off the screen what these quotes are. Living on the streets is physically and emotionally taxing. Said by a lot of real survivors. Financial hardships, or natural disasters, or other types of significant loss at home, family, and or community can lead to homelessness, and homelessness will absolutely create its own kind of trauma, thereby leading to a deterioration of both physical and mental health. Being homeless is isolating, very much so, and disenfranchising, serving only to compound what might already be a pre-existing mental illness or substance use disorder. Again, said by a lot of real survivors, people who work with survivors, about how hard it can be to be facing homelessness when you are going through abuse. And that's just one of the issues, right? When we, again, add all the barriers and a lot of mental health issues on top of that, having children on top of that, having pets on top of that, just makes it a lot harder for victim survivors to really try and escape their abusive situations. So we're going to move on to part two. In this next session, it's about how mental health wellness is impacted by the traumatic experiences of both domestic violence and homelessness. And we've been talking a lot about systems, and now we're going to contextualize what that with a lot more nuanced dynamics of abuse within a relationship. Again, going into all the complex stuff that victim survivors have to really go through when trying to escape abuse. So here we have the cycle of abuse. What does that look like? And if you work with victim survivors, or if you work in a shelter as well, you probably have seen this before. You probably are very familiar with the cycle of abuse. If you've gone through an abusive relationship, you're, of course, very much familiar with this as well. But there are debates about how helpful this model can be. One common misconceptions, by people who haven't experienced domestic violence is that domestic violence is an isolated event. So you'll hear landlords or police officers say that there's a domestic incident or event, so meaning that it's that one-time thing that's happening, but it is not a one-time isolated event. It is a pattern of behaviors that an abuser causes, and a victim survivor has to kind of oftentimes live in survival mode all the time. The cycle can be helpful in affirming that not every waking second is horrific and bad. There are moments like what we call the honeymoon phase. Again, if you work with victim survivors, I'm sure you know what this is. We'll go a little bit deeper into that. The honeymoon phase, where apologies and promises of change are made and hope is kind of instilled into victim survivors. We call that a lot of time love bombing as well. The hope keeps victim survivors in the relationship, or leads them to feeling like they're exaggerating the cause and the harm that's been caused upon them. Making you think like this person can be nice. this person is loving, this person is caring, and I am the crazy one. I am exaggerating all the abuse, when in reality they are not. Uh, and there's maybe a calm where everything seems okay, where survivors may say to themselves that they want to be with this person, the person that the abuser is when they aren't abusive and controlling, can be a very nice individual, again, very sweet, very caring, in that state of calm all the time where you start to think to yourself again, maybe I was exaggerating everything, maybe I was the crazy one, right? Which again, in reality, that is not the case. Um, but as you think about this cycle, the actions, visible to people inside and outside the relationships, it's important to know that this cycle is um, often triggers another cycle for survivors, and that is this cycle of anxiety. So on this slide, we have the cycle of abuse where tension builds up. We have the abusive incident, and then we get into the honeymoon phase where you are promised change, love, support, everything of the sort. We go then into this state of calm, and then it goes back into building tension all over again. So we are now in this abusive cycle all over again. And this right here is the cycle of anxiety. While the cycle of abuse is going on, the survivor is learning its patterns. The tension causes anxiety, and the abuse causes the survivor to seek refuge when the abuser goes to work or when the survivor leaves the house, if they ever get to do that. There's a possibility that they maybe use drugs, alcohol to escape the anxiety and the pain to kind of avoid it. The honeymoon phase causes short-term relief from the anxiety, where again, hope builds up, false promises are made, but the brain remembers the patterns of anxiety, even as the survivor tries to avoid it, and that anxiety never fully goes away. We also hear about how, the body keeps the score, right? And then the cycle again repeats itself all over again. We have someone called Leslie Morgan Steiner, and she says that domestic violence is a carefully laid physical, financial, and psychological trap. Again, if you have been to a lot of our webinars in the past, if you see them through our YouTube channel, or if you've been here before when we do domestic violence 101s and 201s, we talk about how domestic violence is a 24/7 pattern. This is very much going into that, how domestic violence is a cycle, 24/7 pattern, and a lot of times the abuser is then stuck in this cycle, dealing with the abuse, and now they are going through the cycle of anxiety. So consider the lasting impact that this can have on somebody. Once the damage is done, the damage has been done. It takes a long time to really heal and try to heal from the abuse. You'll never fully forget it. You'll never fully um, be able to just, you know, live trauma-free anymore because again, the damage has been done. And there are, of course, many, many ways to move on and to heal, but it takes a long time. It takes a lot of work and effort. And a lot of times the victim survivors need that long-term support from friends and family members and maybe from advocates as well. If you are working with victim survivors of domestic violence, reassuring them, being able to be there for them and help them and support them. So on this slide, domestic violence impacts the whole person. Take a look at this slide. Again, if you've been in a lot of our domestic violence 101, 201 webinars before, you probably have seen this before. But domestic violence impacts the whole person. When we are talking about the cycle of abuse and the cycle of anxiety, it goes beyond just physical abuse, right? A lot of times when we talk about police officers being involved, the law being involved in abuse, a lot of times people talk about the one-time incident that they know about. This person struck the other person physically once, this person hit them a couple times, this person strangled them in this one-time incident, but we know that that is not the case. This has happened before. Physical abuse has probably happened before. a lot of emotional, mental abuse has happened. Financial abuse is probably happening, spiritual, intellectual abuse, everything of the sort. Um, so domestic violence very much impacts the person as a whole. Even if an abuser were to be physically abusive towards a victim survivor, right, that can take a lot of toll on them emotionally and mentally. It's not just, the abuser hits the victim survivor once, the victim survivor forgets about that one incident and keeps on living normally, right? Very much having a lot of emotional and mental distress after that. So when we talk about domestic violence and abuse, we want to make it known that it impacts the person as a whole. And as we talk more about mental health and domestic violence, we want to focus a lot of today's attention on emotional safety, emotional abuse. So the quote on this screen is, "It is not the bruises on the body that hurt, it is the wounds of the heart and the scars on the mind." The next quote says, "For too long, I couldn't tell my story because I didn't know how to make sense of a reality where the person I loved deliberately hurt me. What happened to me is not about physical violence, it's about how they get you turned all upside down. It's about how emotional abuse wraps the weave of your narrative, making you think you deserve what's happening to you." Again, you hear a lot about manipulation and gaslighting when talking about domestic violence. And when we talk about scars, it goes beyond just physical scars, emotional, again, mental. And again, what we talked about in part one, all the barriers to leaving an abusive relationship can very much cause a lot of these emotional and mental distress as well. So what exactly is emotional wellness, and why don't abusers want survivors to have it? Why don't more people focus on it? So emotional wellness is your strength and resilience, your ability to really survive and adapt to changes in a way that keeps your sense of self intact. If your emotional wellness is degraded and eroded, often in small ways over a long period of time, a survivor's ability to adapt can diminish, which can make it really challenging for this person to leave the abusive person, the abusive situation, the abusive individual. And people whose emotional wellness is being abused may begin to think that they deserve what is happening to them and that they are incapable of making moves on their own or moving out of their situation. So, abusive people target their partner's emotional wellness because it's one of the most effective ways to keep the partner under their control. A pattern, a 24/7 pattern of coercion and control of the victim survivor. And this then speaks again to the intentional and strategic nature of abuse. Sorry, reading out loud what's on the screen. If you'd like to, again, leave your thoughts in the chat. How have you seen survivors' emotional wellness impacted by abuse? If there are things that you want to share about your personal life, how your own emotional wellness have been impacted by abuse, feel free to do that if you feel comfortable, of course. But if you work with victim survivors of domestic violence, abuse, anything of this sort, feel free to let us know in the chat how you've seen victim survivors' emotional wellness being impacted by abuse. And as I move on, again, if you are typing in the chat, feel free to continue to do so. So I have another poll for us that I'm going to launch here. There are two questions for this one, so feel free to scroll down. But the first question is, what is your current familiarity with mental health coercion? And number two, in a survey of 2,000 plus crisis line callers, what percent of survivors do you think have reported experiencing mental health coercion? Give us a couple minutes to take that poll. But as you all do that, I will go ahead and talk a little bit more about mental health coercion and what that is, what that sounds like. So one way the trauma of abuse can impact emotional wellness is through direct experiences of mental abuse. And you might be wondering, do people actually experience abuse that targets their mental health? probably why you're here. The answer is a resounding yes, and a term you may now associate with is mental health coercion. Um, and we're going to talk a lot more about what that is, what that looks like, that sounds like. In a bit here, we're going to look at the emotional regulation system and what does that look like for victim survivors. I'll give us another minute or so to take the poll, and then I will share the results and move on. Thank you everyone for taking the poll. I will end it now. Share the results with everybody. So again, number one, what is your current familiarity with mental health coercion? Some people said, I've never heard of it before. Some people said I have an idea of what it is, and others have learned about it before. But nobody is comfortable enough to explain it to somebody who has never heard of it. That's totally okay. We can talk a little bit more about it today. We can use a little refresh. And then for question number 2, in a survey of 2,000 plus crisis line callers, what percentage of survivors do you think have reported experience in mental health coercion? We have people saying 75%, 31%, and 89%. We're going to learn a little bit more about that as we go. Thank you, everybody, again for taking the poll. We'll have one more poll coming later on. But here we have the emotional regulation system impacted by both domestic violence and housing instability by looking at both survivors' effects, at both experiences effects on survivors' emotional regulation system. So on the screen are 3 circles, each corresponding with a different system. We have the drive system, the threat system, and the soothing system. And they all are intended to work together to keep someone emotionally regulated, keeping them safe, making them feel secure, striving to do more, to be more, and being calm when they are in an abusive relationship. So this system gets disrupted by threats to one's survival. And what are domestic violence and housing stability, if not threats to somebody's survival? So both of these experiences are often chronic and occur over extended periods of time. Again, as we talk about domestic violence, a 24/7 pattern. So this also is happening all the time throughout that 24/7 pattern of being in an abusive relationship. And in an initial response to abuse and housing instability, can look like having an overreactive threat system where there's a disproportionate focus on self-protection. So in somebody's drive system, the purpose of that is to motivate us towards resources. And feelings can be wanting something, pursuing something, achieving something, progressing, being focused on something. This is your want and need to do more, to be away from the abuse, to find affordable housing, to find a job. We then have the soothing system. The purpose of that is to manage stress and promote bonding, whether that's self-soothing, finding things to kind of cope with abuse, being around people who are offering you a sense of security and safety, friends and family members who are trusted. Feelings are contented, safe, protected, cared for, and trust. We then have the threat system. The purpose is threat detection and protection. So something like better safe than sorry, trusting your gut feeling, knowing when you are in danger, feelings of anxiety, anger, and disgust. So our emotional regulation system rotating around these 3 when we are in an abusive relationship. And then on this slide, we have the direct impacts on mental health wellness. So not being able to effectively access our drive, soothing, and threat system can kind of manifest into a lot of different ways for victim survivors. So studies and direct experiences of working with survivors have found that people who have experienced domestic violence have higher than average rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, generalized anxiety, suicidal ideation, changes in productivity, concentration, memory, cognition, and arousal. And we often hear from survivors that they have learned to not think highly of themselves, um, not think highly of themselves, their lives, and that they have trouble navigating their lives on their own. A lot of times, victim survivors have a hard time, setting boundaries, um, making decisions on their own because they've been isolated and abused for so long. Um, and we talk about the period of time over a survivor, um, whether they are able to leave an abusive relationship as newfound freedom stage, when survivors are rediscovering who they are, what they like, who they want to be, who they want to become, what they want to do with their lives, everything of the sort falling under the newfound freedom category. Um, though, of course, wanting to point out as well that a lot of times um, freedom doesn't always feel freeing when you are away from an abusive relationship. It can take a lot to heal and to feel free, to feel safe. A lot of times, even if you are away from the abuser, you can still very much be in that fight flight mode where you are constantly looking over your shoulder, trying to make sure that nobody is trying to harm you, being scared, finding things triggering, finding that if you were to hear somebody yelling, that can be very triggering for you. Going out in public can be very triggering for you. So that as well can fall under what it's like trying to navigate life after you are away from the abuse. But on the screen, we just have some direct impacts on mental health wellness. Again, higher than average rates of PTSD and CPTSD. 84% of women who have experienced abuse have reported this. Of course, depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation attempts, undiagnosable, profound and lasting changes in physiological, arousal, emotions, cognition, and memory. Changes in productivity and concentration erode one's sense of self and self-esteem, and of course, loss of agency. Again, a lot of victim survivors have a hard time setting healthy boundaries, being able to make a lot of decisions for themselves. Going through a lot of depression and anxiety can be really hard to get back up and do all of that and make all these decisions. So now let's jump into part 3, how to build your toolkit and walk with victim survivors on their healing journey. What does that look like? So in this section, we'll kind of introduce some skills and approaches and provide space for you to think about integrating some of these information into your connections with people, into your work, and into your personal lives, and maybe people that you know in your personal life. So, okay, a couple more quotes for us. So trauma creates change. You don't choose. Healing is about creating change you do choose. Recovery is based upon the empowerment of the survivor and the creation of new connections. Recovery can take place only within the context of relationships. It cannot occur in isolation. So the reason we talk so much about healing is because with healing comes the opportunity to regain your personal agency and the ability to make your own decisions. At Women's Advocates, every chance that we get to let victim survivors make their own decisions, we want to be able to encourage that, let that happen. Even if a lot of times these decisions aren't what we would personally make for ourselves, or it's not something that we would make for them, we let them make their own decisions, choose their own path, and do what it is that they want to do with their life. So having people like yourselves to be equipped with these kind of skills and ability to hold space for survivors is important in the journey of healing and recovering from trauma, especially if it's interpersonal trauma. Okay. And on this slide is healing happens in relationships, tips for providers and helpers who work with survivors. Continuing with the notion that healing happens in relationships, think about how these tips on the screen can be integrated into your work into your personal life. We're going to walk through all 6 of them very briefly here. So many of you may have heard of a strengths-based approach before. This is in line with focusing on what is right with the victim survivor, acknowledging the self-esteem deterioration that often happens in an abusive relationship, and creating a dynamic that explores, validates, and centers the survivor's strengths. Another important consideration is to acknowledge power dynamics inherently in a helper slash helping this person dynamic. So we have the helper and the person that's being helped. There is someone who holds a position of power and actively work with the survivor to kind of solidify roles and expectations of each other. Again, going into letting the victim survivor make a lot of choices and decisions for themselves, finding ways to engage in non-coercion, and creating space for the survivor to kind of reclaim their agency in that space. We then have authentic connection. So embracing the commonality that they're both complex, nuanced human beings, make space to kind of bond regarding things outside of their trauma and experiences, going beyond building rapport, and to the importance of feeling seen, heard, and respected as is, that they are enough as they are. So building that authentic connection between the worker, the person helping, and the person that's being helped. So for example, you and the person that you are working with, whether that's a client, a victim survivor, anybody of the sort, having that authentic connection between the two of you that goes beyond just trauma. Next, we have honoring the survivor's story. So avoid making assumptions. Create space for survivors to share their parts of their stories and experiences as they feel comfortable and safe to. Don't pry into anything. They are able and free to share whatever it is that they are comfortable with. And of course, meet their sharing with compassion and meeting the survivor where they are at currently. But many helpers have a vision for where they would like their client to be. And while setting goals and moving forward, it is important that we, set goals for ourselves and for the victim survivors, hoping to see progress as time goes on. But being with the victim survivors and hearing their story, we want to be able to meet them where they are at currently. If they are really struggling with certain things, we want to be able to be there to support them and help them with anything that they need. For example, if they're really struggling to set healthy boundaries, how can we encourage that? What do we have to do then, not just with our words, but with our actions as well, to kind of mirror that, showcase that, but also let them be able to learn how to set healthy boundaries as time goes on. And last but not least, we have defining what survivor focused / driven healing means. This is creating a balance between helping a survivor build their own tool belt, build their own toolkit of resources, to asking survivors what their needs are and how they wish to fulfill them. We have a lot of safety planning ways to do so. And being able to talk with victim survivors about what they need when they're trying to escape an abusive relationship. If they are away from the abuse, if they are away from the abusive person, what do they need now to be able to move on, to heal, to get what they need? Being all part of their tool belt, their toolkit, being there to support them and help them. So tool number 1, operationalizing a trauma-informed lens. If you would like, feel free to share into the chat the question that we have on the screen here. What is a specific example of how you could put these values into action in your work with survivors? Again, if you'd like to leave that into the chat, feel free to do so. But for the remaining slides, we will discuss the specific tools that you can add to your toolbox for walking with survivors on their healing journey, especially as they are trying to find stable housing. And the 6 components that kind of pertain to a trauma-informed lens that we have on the screen are trust, safety, collaboration, choice, empowerment, and compassion. So what do these words mean to you in your work, in your lives, when working with victim survivors, or simply working or being around friends and family members who may have gone through abuse? How do you put these into action when you are working with them? And if you have done so in the past, how did that look? How did that go? Feel free to leave in the chat if you are able to, if you feel comfortable. But on the screen, on this slide, is a concrete example for how you can kind of incorporate that theme into your work with victim survivors. So for example, saying something like, your emotional and physical safety is a priority to us here. What can we do to help you feel safe? You know, asking them, letting them make their own choices. This question leads right into that, letting them make their own choices into what they need, what they want, meeting them where they are at, being able to provide them with the resources and help that they need. Another one is, you deserve love, respect, connection, and healing. I believe in you, and you have what it takes to make this next step in your journey. A lot of times, a lot of encouraging comments is important. But yeah, we have all sorts of ways you can kind of use a trauma-informed lens with the people that you work with victim survivors in your own lives, maybe with yourselves even. But we have trust, safety, collaboration, choice, empowerment, and compassion. Okay. So now we have tool number 2. So tool number 1 was a trauma-informed lens, looking at it from a trauma-informed lens. Now we have number 2, implement a collaborative approach to assessment. So one component of a trauma-informed approach that we wanted to highlight is collaboration. Of course, again, going back to a couple of slides back, having that authentic collaboration and connection with the victim survivor. Talking specifically how we can take a collaborative approach to assessments, and the relationship between an advocate, caseworker, or ally and a survivor should be a collaborative partnership. So making a shift from things like, I assess a survivor's needs, to saying like, I help the survivor assess their own needs. Again, going along that line of letting them make their own choices. And oftentimes knowing that you are asking leading questions, not assuming, and allowing them to answer in their own words, in their own time. So on the screen are some questions that you can use to kind of work with victim survivors as they identify their primary needs and opportunities for you to kind of support them in ways that are very specific to their needs. So again, instead of saying, I assess the participant's needs, you say something like, I help the participant assess their own needs. And if you had asking questions like, if you had to name the biggest challenge in your life right now, what would that be? You know, what does the life you want look like? What barriers are in the way of that life right now? And all of these questions lead to letting the victim survivor really then making their own choice, thinking about their own lives, and being able to tell you what it is that they want, what their wants and needs are in order to better their life, in order to better their healing journey. But when working with them, we want to be able to use the right language, the proper language, ask the right questions in order to really help them on their healing journey, to understand them better, and to be able to better collaborate and connect with them. We then have the potential needs of survivors in your program for this slide. So sometimes survivors and program participants may be so overwhelmed with trauma, frustration, anger. They may be so afraid that they can't immediately identify what their needs are. This is normal. That's completely fine and okay. You can provide them with options, a short list of common problems participants need to kind of assistance or assist them to kind of figure out what it is their wants and needs are. Maybe they didn't identify childcare as a need at first, but you show them a list of services and they now realize that that would be helpful. Even if they don't need it immediately right now, that is something that they would like to keep in mind in case they do need it, something like that. So try to kind of structure your intakes, assessments, and other meetings to kind of allow for participants to process and fully understand what it is that they need. And a lot of times patience is key. So giving the participants, the client, the victim survivor, enough time to kind of develop a clear picture of their needs and what it is that they want and how you can then help them achieve that. And if not given enough time and patience, victim survivors may identify something that isn't actually a need just so they can kind of give you an answer, right? Being under pressure to give an answer, they just kind of identify whatever it is. So being patient, keeping in mind to be mindful of this person, and that a lot of times it could be, it could take a little bit longer for them to really open up and talk about what their wants and needs are, or to figure out what their wants and needs are. Because when you've been in survival mode for so long, not having the time to really think about yourself, what your wants and needs are for yourself and your children and your pets, it can be hard when you are asked and put on the spot immediately to think about something like that. So we then have tool number 3, so honor survivors' whole selves. We talked about how domestic violence impacts a person as a whole. So when we are meeting and working with victim survivors, we want to honor them as their whole selves. Our third, so while working with victim survivors, again, honoring their whole selves, being able to understand them, that they have gone through a lot physically, emotionally, mentally, financially. And if you would feel comfortable, again, to write in the chat, choose 1 or 2 dimensions on the screen of wellness that you don't tend to focus on. What is a strategy that you could implement that would help this dimension of wellness for a survivor or for yourself, if you'd like to think deeper into that? So what dimensions on the screen, from emotional, spiritual, intellectual, physical, environmental, financial, and occupational and social, do you not think about or focus on enough? And you would like to do that, and then how you can implement that into your work. But being able to meet the victim survivor they are at, honoring their whole selves, being able to understand, again, with the patience in the earlier slide, being patient with them and understanding that they have gone through a lot, and that we want to be able to help them tackle everything all at once. And it's harder to do. It's easier said than done, but we want to do our best in helping them be able to emotionally heal, physically heal, mentally heal, helping them out financially with jobs, anything that we can offer, any resources that we can offer, and really just trying to help the victim survivor get back on track with whatever it is that they need. So again, if you're typing in the chat, feel free to continue to do that. But I'm going to move on to tool number 4. So meeting the survivors where they are in their healing journey. More stuff for you to write in the chat if you'd like. So what path do you think you are on right now? If you were to think about it, all the paths on the screen, on the left side, from renewing, surviving, stabilizing, flowing, freeing, yearning, openings, choosing, etc., etc. Feel free to think about which path you are on, or path you think most survivors are on when you start to work with them, and how can we meet ourselves and others where they are at currently. So this last tool is really to just encourage providers to truly meet survivors where they are at in their healing journey. Maybe they are not even there yet. Maybe they just got out of the abusive relationship. They don't know what to do. We still want to meet them where they are at. And one way to really be able to facilitate and process all of this is to familiarize survivors with languages that describe where they are at, so that they can kind of think about this for themselves. And a lot of the words being on the screen on this slide can be used to describe that. So knowing what people's coping mechanisms are, knowing what they can do now to kind of calm themselves when they are in a state where things kind of start to get too much for them. And by being able to identify where we are in our own lives, in our own paths, we're then able to authentically connect and collaborate with victim survivors and their journey as well. So again, if you feel like you want to write something in the chat, feel free to do so. We now have tool number 5, integrating a healing-centered engagement approach. I am going to launch another poll for us. Okay, 2 questions for this one. So again, scroll down. So the first question is, which of the healing-centered engagement components do you already do really well? And which of these healing-centered engagement components do you want to continue to improve on and focus on? Feel free to answer that for me. But as you do that, I will just go in and talk a little bit more about tool number 5 here. But at Women's Advocates, we honor both trauma-informed modalities and healing-centered engagement approaches. And we do a lot of research with a lot of this. So Dr. Sean Ginwright coined this approach and describes the following 6 components: empathy, imagination, reflection, calm, contain, and care. So being, again, as you guys take the poll, I can read this out loud to us, taking a moment to just read what these are exactly. So for empathy, being vulnerable, open, and honest will encourage survivors to do the same if it is safe for them. For imagination, encourage survivors to imagine. Dreaming is critical to fostering a sense of hope. So seeing beyond the traumatic event is vital. Imagining what they want for themselves, what they see for themselves in the long run. So reflection, critical reflection entails examining one's response to trauma and taking action to build power and control back into one's life. We have calm, practice calm, centeredness and gentle breathing, and model it for the survivor you are working with. Contain, only ask for a level of trauma detail that is critical to healing. Do not ask for more than is needed. Allow the survivor to control how much they want to share. And last but not least, we have care. So practice compassion for yourself, for survivors, and for others around you. I'm going to end the poll now. Thank you all for taking that poll. I am going to share these results with us. So for question 1, which of the healing-centered engagement components do you already do really well? A lot of you said empathy, calm, and care. And then for the second one, which ones you want to continue to improve on? A lot of you also said empathy as well. Imagination is the number 1. And calm is the next one. But yeah, being able to encourage survivors to imagine, dreaming about their lives, what they want for themselves is great in trying to foster a sense of hope. So sounds like a plan to me. And it's great to know that a lot of you already are good with empathy, calm, and care. Thank you all for taking the poll and being able to identify what you are good at and what you want to focus on when working with victim survivors. So this next part, now that we've kind of identified which component of healing-centered engagement that you would like to grow and focus on, we do have some suggestions in the form of open-ended questions that you can ask the survivors in your life or the survivors that you work with. So for example, let's do the imagination one. A lot of you said you want to focus on that one. So something you can ask is, sometimes people create vision boards to visualize what they want in their lives. Would you like to make one together? And again, this leads to letting the victim survivor make the choice for themselves. Do they want that or do they not? The next one that we have is empathy. Somebody else said empathy in the poll. So asking questions like, would you like to take a break before we talk about what happened? The next question is, I noticed that you've had a hard time focusing. Is there anything you would like to talk about? And the last one I want to talk about is calm, because somebody also said calm in the poll. It says, have you ever heard of 4-7-8 breathing? We can try it together. The longer exhales help activate the rest and digest part of your nervous system. If you're not familiar, the 7-8 breathing is quite literally when you breathe and you count to 4, you count to 7, you count to 8. It's a whole exercise that we do at Women's Advocates when we are working with victim survivors. Um, but yeah, these are all open-ended questions that you can ask when working with victim survivors if that is something that you want to kind of nurture and focus on, and how you can be better at supporting somebody's imagination, being more, having more empathy towards somebody, or helping somebody reach a state of calm. So wrapping it all up together, we kind of wanted to ensure that some housing resources were a part of your toolbox as well. So we have a pretty comprehensive housing resources on our websites that we've kind of linked to this. We have ways you can inform survivors about housing, um, how you can support on a political level. So things like rent control, funding for shelters, affordable housing for large families. And you can learn a lot more about that in our housing resources. And again, I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, as the webinar ends and we send out follow-up emails, you will get a lot of links to our websites and everything of the sort. So if you want to browse around for more safe housing options, you have the choice, the free will to do that later on. And so for this slide, we want to kind of remind you that the way we respond to someone's experiences of abuse is extremely impactful, and it can validate what the abusive person has ingrained, or it can challenge it and promote change. Again, when you have been through abuse, so much abuse, and being told that you are, worthless, that you need the abusive person in their lives, that you are dumb, that you are stupid, a lot of people start to believe it. So we want to kind of change that narrative. We want to say the right things and be able to help victim survivors on their healing journey in any way that we can. And the things on the screen now are just some things that you can say to victim survivors when working with them to kind of help foster healing. You can think of anything else that you've said in the past that you like, or things that you say now to victim survivors, things that you say to yourself that are kind. Feel free to leave it in the chat. So some of the ones that we have on the screen are saying something like, it's okay to cry, or whatever you are thinking and feeling, you're welcome here. It's normal to feel overwhelmed in situations like this. I'm not going to judge you for feeling upset. You might just want to sit and relax for a bit. You can do that here. Or I wonder if you realize how hard you're working. When was the last time you slept comfortably? Being able to see the victim survivor, being able to validate their feelings, being there for them and support them is something that we want to do in order to foster healing and try and stop the cycle of domestic violence and abuse. So officially reaching the end here. Some resources available to us: national hotlines, crisis, some further readings that we were able to kind of integrate into today's webinar. Again, you can get the slides to all of this in a bit here. We will also send this out later. But this is a post-webinar survey, so I am going to copy and paste it into the chat in case anybody wants to take that post-webinar survey from me. That would be highly appreciated. We are at the end here, reaching the end. This is our online survivor support group. It says open gender and women's group, but now we have just one all-inclusive group. Anybody and everybody can join. If anybody is interested, feel free to tell them about us. We will be in touch with them. But we have reached the end of today's webinar. Thank you all for being here, for participating in the polls, and for introducing yourselves and everything. Hopefully, you are able to kind of learn new ways to help support victim survivors, how mental health, homelessness, everything of the sort really impacts a victim survivor's mental health. And yeah, really just thank you all for being here and for listening.